It's the first time I come to a Transform meeting, and I'm really grateful because this kind of discussion is extremely important in this very difficult context for the international left. So my first point is about the reality of the authoritarian turn in France. Of course, one of the things that comes to mind right now when we think about authoritarianism is the COVID-19 crisis and how it changed a lot of things in our daily lives. Governments dealt with the crisis with very authoritarian means, but more generally in some countries, and especially in France, they also used the health crisis to move to a more authoritarian form of political domination. It's not a simple and mechanical effect of the virus itself, as we know, because we could imagine quite easily more democratic and actually more efficient ways to fight such a virus. But most governments reacted in a very repressive and paternalistic way. And obviously in France, it was very intense. But the authoritarian turn hasn't begun in France with the COVID crisis. It was already on the way since at least 2016, with when the big social movement against the labor market reform faced violent repression, or obviously in 2018 and 19, when we saw the most brutal repression of any social movement in France for decades, like 60 years, I would say. Namely the Yellow Vest movement. 25 people lost an eye due to flashball shots from the police. 5 people lost a hand. Just before of me on one demonstration actually in front of the National Assembly because of grenades thrown by the police. 1,000 people have been jailed due to their participation to the movement. 1,200 people have been given a suspended sentence. More than 12,000 people have been in police custody during the months of the movement for participating to it. These are figures unprecedented in France for the last 60 years. I speak under the control of Pablo. He would say if it's true. So this is one element of the authoritarian turn, the most visible. An intensified repression of social movements, but it articulates with years of regression of civic liberties. In France, we have lived mostly since 2015 in a state of emergency, which gave like a new arbitrary powers to the police, to the administration, and to the executive power. So this was first justified, obviously, by terrorist attacks in November 2015, but it stayed in place until 2017. And when Macron put an end to the state of emergency, he actually translated most of the emergency measures in the common law. For example, all the measures that increase the powers of the police and the arbitrary powers of the police. With the pandemic, we went back to the state of emergency, and after the terrible murder of a teacher by a jihadist terrorist, the government passed 2 different laws, one called global security, which increased even more police powers and included like private security agency in the old dispositif of repression. And another law which was targeting explicitly and directly Islam and Muslims. As another element of the authoritarian acceleration, we should also mention the fact that the rule of law in France is not something that is simply under a threat. It's already partly refused to minority, especially migrants. There's a lot of reports on that, especially in the north of France, in Calais. Muslims. France has been convicted a few times in international institutions for religious discrimination. Romani people living in poor neighborhoods who are mostly blacks and Arabs, etc. It has to be stressed that authoritarianism has increased together with the politics of racism, especially Islamophobia. That hasn't been only a means of propaganda for the far-right forces, which it is, and maybe their major means of propaganda, but has been constantly used and implemented by governments over the last 20 years. Of course, Islamophobia is not a thing which is specific to France. We've seen an Islamophobic huge movement in Germany, Pegida. We've seen the success of Islamophobic ideologues like in Italy, like Oriana Fallaci, for instance, selling millions of copies of awful books against Muslims. What seems specific to France in this matter is the degree of institutionalization of Islamophobia in the name of a very strange understanding of secularism, like laïcité. The rights of Muslims have already been reduced, and with the new law I was talking about just before, the state is trying to control the religious practices of Muslims and imams and restraining the right to free speech. For instance, if an imam doesn't, if an imam says there's institutional Islamophobia in France, he will be accused of separatism, and his mosque could be closed just by saying that there is institutional Islamophobia. Actually, a collective against Islamophobia has just been disbanded by the government like last week and the accusation was that it was like feeding the hatred against France because they are saying like there's state or institutional Islamophobia. Well, and last but not least, the government has disbanded another and the biggest actually anti-racist organization like 6 months ago, I would say, a bit more, the CCIF, Collectif contre l'Islamophobie en France, which was we had like more than 12,000 members, which was working with the international institutions and also the historic organizations that defends human rights, like the La Ligue des Droits de l'Homme and all that. My second point is about the fact that authoritarianism shouldn't be perceived only as a specific features of Macron's politics, because this authoritarian trend began with Sarkozy almost 20 years ago. But the paradox is that a government which was supposed to be left, the one of François Hollande, went much further in that direction. So it's not about the political personality of Sarkozy or Hollande or Macron. It's about the general politics of the ruling class in France, more generally than in France. And if we want to go further and understand that situation, we need to see the hardening of the state as an expression of the deepening social contradictions, which to be specifically intense in France. To be short, I would say that on the side of the capitalist class, there's a contradiction between the very high degree of domination of capital on workplaces and the destabilization of political rule. This contradiction is a direct effect of the capitalist offensive that we usually call neoliberalism. On one side, neoliberal policies led by governments for the last 40 years, more or less, made very difficult for workers to fight specifically on their workplaces, to get unionized and all that, especially in the private sector, especially through strikes, which is still the specific weapon workers do have to impose their interests. And on the other side, neoliberalism has broken the social compromise on which was founded the active popular consent to the political order. And then it had the effect to weaken political parties in many countries, and especially in France, where market-driven policies are very much contested for 25 years. This political destabilization of the ruling class reached a very high point in France in the last 10 years, as both dominant parties, right-wing and central-left, which represented between 60 to 70% of the voters, fell to 25 in the last presidential election, and then to 15 in the last European election. So the main political instrument that the capitalist class had in France to rule actually are destroyed, more or less. So there's here a deep crisis of political representation, and I would say a crisis of hegemony, or at least hegemonic instability, which means the capitalist class exploit economically more than ever and still dominate politically, especially in the absence of any left alternative. But its capacity to win the active consent of a majority of people has declined dramatically, especially in a country in France where you have like quite regular massive social movements. On the side of the working class, the thing in France is that there has been mass social struggles since especially 2016, as you know, but there are at least 3 problems that I would like to emphasize. First, these struggles are strong enough to bother the French capitalist class, which is politically weakened, which leads this class to turn to more authoritarian methods. But these struggles are not strong enough at this point to win even defensive battles against pro-capitalist reforms, and even more so to crystallize through a political left alternative, or to at least to push towards the building of a left alternative. The other difficulty in the situation is that we still have difficulty to build alliances between social movements, even if there has been some progress at this level. For instance, the leader of the main French union, the CGT, has participated to demonstrations against police brutality and also against Islamophobia, which would have been unthinkable like only 10 years ago. So it shows even leaders of the main political parties did that, like Mélenchon, for instance. Another problem that we face is that we have seen effectively the emergence of a new radical activist generation, but which has problems to build, like I would say, organic relations to the masses. And a good instance of that is universities, where there is a layer quite large of radical activists. I would say larger than 15 years ago, a lot of people saying they're anti-capitalist and all that, really radical people, but which hasn't been able to build mass movement in universities in the last 10 years, which is really different from the previous cycle of struggles between 1995 and 2010, where there was like almost every year some huge mass movement in the student youth. I would like to conclude by stressing the double necessity for the left to put back anti-fascism to the core of its agenda, but also to take seriously the actualization of anti-fascism. My point is that we need like more anti-fascism for quite obvious reasons. Also, other reasons that I didn't speak about because I don't have time to give you like a whole description of the landscape of the far right, which is depressing right now, France. But so we need more anti-fascism, and this anti-fascism will have something to do with interwar anti-fascism. But if we want it to be effective, we cannot simply use the old forms of anti-fascism, neither I would say the workerist one, nor the anarchist one. We need to think collectively about what could be an anti-fascism of the 21st century. So I would like to highlight a few points on that. The first point is the fact that the main reasons for the rise of the far right are not mainly linked to the specific ability of the far right itself, but to mainstream politics. That is, to the policies that have been implemented in the last decades, and to the fact that the right wing and the Socialist Party went more and more in the direction of the far right, giving more and more legitimacy to far right propaganda, especially on three questions: migrations, Islamophobia, and insecurity. It shouldn't be a surprise because fascism has always been the complex product of, on one hand, the development of far right movements and ideas, which is the obvious part of the story, and on the other hand, of a reactionary radicalization of sections of the ruling class, which allowed the fascists to come to power by illegal means, at least in Italy and Germany. So it means that anti-fascism cannot be only about fighting the far right. An anti-fascism that would only be a defense of democracy against the far right threat, or like a street-level fight against fascist thugs, would be dramatically insufficient to face the deep neo-fascist dynamics. So anti-fascism has to link organically this fight to actual struggles against the authoritarian and racist politics of the ruling class, Macron at that time, especially when it radicalizes, as we experience now in France. Otherwise, it's unlikely that anti-fascism will be able to attract the most oppressed segments of the working class, because a lot of non-white people, for instance, would say, actually, I heard this discussed quite a lot. I haven't been brutalized by fascists. I have been controlled, humiliated, and even brutalized by the police. And it's true that the police killed much more non-white people than the far right in the last decades in France. Like, two journalists showed that there has been like around 750 people in the last who died after a police intervention in the last 40 years, mostly young black people or Arab males from poor neighborhoods. My second point is about racism under the form, especially of Islamophobia, which is obviously one of the pillars of far-right electoral and ideological successes in Western Europe, but also a motive for fascist terrorist attacks against Muslims, but also against Jews and left activists, because in the conspiracy form of Islamophobia, the Jews and the left are presented as those who use immigration and Muslim to destroy the nation, to destroy the West, the traditional values, identities, and so on. Islamophobia has also been largely used, as I said, by centrist governments to justify states of emergency, but also military interventions in the global south, especially in the French case. So my point is very simple on that. That has been actually very complicated in practice for the French left in the last 20 years. At least in Western Europe, the struggle against Islamophobia and more generally against racism is absolutely central for anti-fascism. It's also a necessary task if we want anti-fascism to be rooted, which is not right now, among racially oppressed minorities. The third point, I have to be quick, is about globalization, quite a complicated problem, which has been one of the major ways for the capitalist class to put an end to the cycle of popular struggles in the 70s. But it is obvious that the European Union has been the main political instrument of capitalist globalization in Europe, building like a legal architecture adapted to its implementation. So my point here is to say that anti-fascism in Europe has a complex task to define itself against capitalist globalization and against the European Union, which feeds xenophobia by putting workers in competition with other workers, but also to revive concrete international solidarity, which is more a question than an answer, but a question that we need to address in the future, in the near future. I just have like two last points, quick last points. The rise of the far right is not mostly a reaction to workers' combativity and a fortiori to a revolutionary dynamics, which doesn't seem on the agenda for the near future. It's more like a delusional and pathological expression of the absence of a left alternative in the context of a workers' movement weakening. The only period of time when anti-fascism was a mass movement rooted in working class was when it was connected to working class project and to an alternative socialist was connected to working class organization and to an alternative socialist project, which is we won't be able to face the fascist threat only with anti-fascism. We will need to link organically also anti-fascism to a new a socialist project. And the last point I wanted to make is that the ecological crisis has already begun to intensify the systemic contradictions of capitalism. It will be more and more the case in the following years, as we know, and decades. As it will give new justifications for governments to impose more authoritarian measures, and it will feed xenophobic neo-Malthusian propaganda around overpopulation and appeals to criminalize even more migration from the global source. And most of the far right has already seen the political profit they can make by proposing a nationalist and racist greenwashing. So we know it's stupid, but it can be efficient propaganda. So if the left doesn't emerge as an alternative with a powerful counter-hegemonic narrative integrating ecological priorities, the far right will necessarily take advantage of the situation by promoting xenophobic and imperialist solutions. Okay, I will stop. Thanks for listening.